The 1240th day of war. In Russia, the Army 2025 Forum was cancelled. This is the most important event where new products were demonstrated, soldiers communicated with designers, and volunteers and developers had a chance to directly go to generals. Before that, the forum was held, but now, as the specialists estimate, firstly, there's no time for it in the military because of the tense situation at the front, and secondly, organizers are afraid of the arrival of Ukrainian drones. The US has not yet had a clear roadmap with partners on the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Many countries have found out about the presence of a plan right at the moment when Trump announced it. In general, the US president, as always, is in a hurry. The problem is that it is not very easy to turn words into action for him. A number of countries expressed their readiness, and we hope that the supplies are close to realization. Russian military officer S. Svyatoslav Golikov says that this is not the case with the Russian army of unmanned systems. While in Ukraine, they are developing all, without exception, unmanned units. In Russia, they provide only the parade units, which show high results in the damage to all other drone operators forced to sit without drones and call on the help of the favorites of the Ministry of Defense of the Rubicon Center. Russian military personnel are immediately taken prisoner by assault. More than 100 prisoners of war who died on the front managed to be recovered. Half of them died in the first year after the exchange. The Russian command does not care that the forced release of prisoners of war to participate in military actions is another violation of international law. Those Russian fighters who return to Russia with their feet forward are buried literally in the dumps, and even as if in a joke, Russian flags are stuck in the garbage. Local administrations don't care, so all that's left for the survivors of the garbage heroes of the Soviet Union is to record a video message in the empty space. About this and much more in today's fresh summary, which you can support with your like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, especially your subscriptions. They are important for YouTube algorithms. The plan to supply Ukraine, which Trump announced, does not yet exist. The US president did not notify the country's allies about its presence and details in advance. On Monday, he provided only a general scheme of new supplies of weapons to Ukraine and not a detailed plan, says Reiter. Now the most difficult thing to do is to negotiate with the countries that will transfer their systems, including the Patriot missile complexes, to Kyiv. The exact list of countries that will take part in the scheme is unknown. During a meeting with Trump in the Oval Office on Monday, NATO Secretary Mark Rutte mentioned 6 states: Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, and Canada, which, in his words, is ready to participate in the purchase of weapons scheme. However, high-ranking sources in the embassies of 2 of these countries in Washington reported that they learned about the plan from public statements. That is, apparently not only Trump, but also URUT was not ready for the plan. Although the very idea of purchasing weapons from Western countries to Ukraine was discussed earlier, even the closest allies of the United States apparently learned about the offer in real time, says Reiter. I have a clear feeling that no one has been informed about specific details in advance. I also suspect that the administration itself is only now beginning to understand what this means in practice, said one of the European ambassadors. At the same time, the United States itself has not yet decided what exactly will be transferred to Ukraine. The Trump administration began to analyze NATO reserves to understand what could be transferred to Ukraine, said one of the American officials. The next step is to try to convince allies to donate Ukrainian equipment in exchange for a certain form of compensation, added an agency spokesman. Trump personally participates in the negotiations, said another American official. Details of the supply of weapons are still being discussed, confirmed the representative of NATO. A number of European countries have already announced their readiness to support this initiative, including Germany, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, the UK, Canada, and Finland, said the spokesman for NATO and Alliance. There is also no clarity as to what Patriot Trump was talking about when announcing their transfer to Ukraine. NATO will hold a meeting with the country owners of Patriot anti-aircraft systems to help Ukraine on Wednesday, July 23, said the NATO agency with a reference to the source. If at the meeting the US will definitely promise to put Patriots in the place of Ukraine in a clear period of time. And one can hope that someone will share their complexes, as it was done, for example, in Romania last year. As the Wall Street Journal says, the idea itself appeared as Trump's emotional reaction to one of the Russian shelling. The president himself called Merz. After another shelling, Ukraine suddenly agreed to sell Kyiv not 2, but 5 Patriot systems at once. Initially, Merz himself suggested that Trump buy 2 PVO systems from the US after stopping the help of Ukraine, but the one who writes Wall Street Journal did not even know about the pause in supplies and, surprisingly, asked the Minister of Defense Peter Hegseth what was going on. A few days later, seeing the consequences of the new attack on Ukraine, Trump himself called Merz and agreed to sell the PVO. The chancellor did not expect that the US president would lose patience with Putin so quickly and immediately agreed to buy all 5 Patriots, writes the publication. Now it remains to be understood what kind of 5 Patriots this is, what kind of supplies and production they're talking about, and in what terms they can be put up. Since we are talking about Trump, his policy has become unpredictable, spontaneous, and decisive, without the possibility of this decisiveness to agree with reality. So far, the implementation of their decisions raises a lot of questions, but the main thing is that there is a fundamental position, although it can change at any moment, so it would be nice for the European leaders to hurry up. Basically, I saw a lot of publications in which something unexpected was done from this. I would rather be surprised if it turned out that there was already a plan and Trump made a public statement after the vote for Trump with his partners. That is, you know, not the news when a dog bit a person, but the news when a person bit a dog. Because, in fact, we have known Trump for a long time, and it would be quite strange to imagine that he has a clear plan that he follows. No, this is a rather chaotic person. The other thing is that it is quite problematic and difficult to quickly implement the things that come to his mind. Europe is slowly, not only Europe, plus Canada in general, the countries, allies of Ukraine and partners of the United States, they already, it seems to me, in theory, should understand who they are dealing with and should have quite effective protocols in order to, when Trump will come to his senses, to quickly be able to take advantage of this moment in order to really turn everything as effectively as possible. But in any case, there is a decision, there is a statement, there is a political will, it remains to be implemented. Well, and here I strongly hope for Merz, who, as it were, shows that he is a slonery. And in general, this is without exaggeration, at least in my perception, one of the most adequate Western leaders in the past decades. So far, everything he says and everything he does is agreed, first of all, with his previously voiced positions, and secondly, with what reality is now required from the West, what decisive actions to help stop Russian aggression and secure this world. The holding of the previously announced International Military and Technical Forum of the Army 2025 was cancelled by the Ministry of Defense of Russia. From the link to the sources, the Kommersant reports the news. The forum's website has also disappeared from the mention of the planned events. The organizer of the forum is the Ministry of Defense, and the official platform of the forum is the Patriot Exhibition Center in the Moscow city of Kubinka. Independent military expert Ivan Karpov, in a conversation with Insider, notes that the main reason for the cancellation of the forum is the burden on the military-industrial complex. The industry has neither people nor time for this, he says. The same opinion is held by the Russian military expert, who wished to remain anonymous. The latter also noted that the forum gave the opportunity to directly break through to generals from the VPC, representatives of the client from the Ministry of Defense. Now it is necessary to break through a dense series of secretaries, assistants, guards, and naides, he says. Another important reason for the cancellation of the forum, Ivan Karpov calls a potential threat to the attack of Ukrainian UAVs during the event. There is a threat to security, of course. In Kubinka, even more so, the blows have already been applied. In the Z channels, the threat to security is considered the most important reason for the cancellation of the forum. For example, this is what was written on the channel news from the world of unmanned systems. The reason for the cancellation is not voiced by anyone, they write correctly. Why say the obvious? After June 1, the sequence of drone raids in Kamikaze, Moscow, and Moscow region, it became clear to hold a forum. Their conditions. This is no longer about a demonstration of force, but about a provocation of fate. Who is willing to be disgraced by shaking the siren and PVO and take responsibility for such a development of events? Last year, personally, I was worried. Panzers were standing around the perimeter like guards at the carnival. This year, no one would believe even in them. In general, such forums are most often an exhibition of analogous products that were not usually seen at the front. However, at such an event, representatives of the defense can pay attention to some really promising development. So it's good that this forum does not take place. Well, it makes sense to specify separately. Again, I don't know how much we often say that here is the result. Well, that is, the result is in the face of Russia. For the past 3.5 years, not only has been waging an aggressive, seductive war, but also constantly talking about its successes, about the fact that now we will capture everything, we will achieve everything, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the situation of Russia itself, all 3.5 years, is rapidly deteriorating, both economically and from the point of view of the same security. If 3.5 years ago you had said to someone that Ukraine would attack Moscow region, Moscow, Voronezh, and many other Russian cities, well, we will not even talk about operating on the web, then they would. have twisted their fingers and said that they were sick. Well, that is, Russia, even skeptics would have said that no, Russia would not allow this, Russia is a strong state, Russia has a strong army, a strong PVO, and so on. Now, in July 2025, Ukrainian attacks on the Russian territory became commonplace. Attacks on factories of the military-industrial complex, attacks on military units on airfields. That is, Ukrainian attacks became a landscape of reality, not a one-off story, as it was even in 2023 or 2004, but a constant background in which the cancellation of events, military events, is considered to be something that does not cause a storm of emotions. Such successes in 3.5 years. Well, if Russia hopes that either the officials or some of the residents who support the Russian invasion and Vladimir Putin hope that the situation will begin to improve, then, to put it mildly, we have not seen this in 3.5 years. Well, that is, we have not seen a dynamic for improvement, we only see a dynamic for deterioration. Russia now controls less territory than in 2022, Russia has less economic opportunities, Russia has less military opportunities due to the loss of a huge amount of equipment, including which has been inherited since the Soviet times, including aircraft. So no, the dynamics are negative and so far nothing has been seen that could change this dynamic. Well, and accordingly, Russia continues the terror tactic, that is, the attack on objects of civilian infrastructure, on civilian objects, on peaceful cities and on peaceful citizens. In Vinica, the drone was attacked by the Polish Barlanik factory, reported in the Ministry of Poland. Russian drone operators struck the Barlanik factory in Vinica. The director of the factory just told me that it was a premeditated attack from 3 areas. There are victims, including 2 with severe burns. Ukrainian services work at the scene, as well as our consulate, said the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radzislav Sikorski. Earlier, in the prosecutor's office of the Vinica region, it was reported that as a result of the attack on industrial facilities in Vinica, 8 people were injured. They have various degrees of damage, including burns. You probably thought that Barlanik is some kind of company that is engaged in the production of weapons, but this is not the case. Barlanik is engaged in the production of parquet boards and other wooden surfaces. So this attack does not look like a strike on military objects, although it is obvious that it got into Russian reports just like that. It does not matter where to hit. On the one hand, the tactics of terror is approved and initiated by the Russian authorities, and on the other hand, where would the Russian maximum, that is, where the drone got, there was a goal, there was a meeting of NATO generals, there was a military object on the production of combat mosquitoes and nuclear weapons and so on. In addition, the mayor of the Latvian city of Ogre was injured in Ukraine as a result of a Russian shelling, LSM reports. Agelis Helmanis was injured during another volunteer trip to the prefrontal zone. According to the municipality, on the night of July 16, he was shot. Helmanis regularly brings help to Ukraine since 2022. This time he accompanied a column of 20 cars. His condition is stable. People were killed, 27 were injured as a result of a Russian attack on Dobropillia, Donetsk region, local authorities reported, and rescuers are extinguishing the fire to disassemble the rubble and clearly determine the number of victims, said the head of the Donetsk OVO, Vadim Filishkin. He clarified that an air bomb K-500 had been dropped on the city. As already written in Deep State, Russians strike drones and now air bombs on Dobropillia to block Ukrainian logistics routes to Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, and Kramatorsk. However, at the same time, Russian armed forces, without a doubt, conscience is beaten on civilian objects. The matter of life in the city is unbearable. There is a certain people's logic in this. Ukrainian military visit the rear cities to rest in human conditions, repair cars, stock up on the items of the first necessity, and so on. If you make the city unfit for life, this will cause a blow to the supply and combat spirit of the fighters of the Ukrainian Defense Force. In fact, the same tactic has already been used in Syria, when the Russian aviation plannedly destroyed hospitals, markets or bakeries, warehouses with humanitarian aid to civil defense centers, thereby simultaneously depriving the rebels of the social and economic base and exacerbating the migration crisis in Europe. Now the tactic of a total war against not only an armed enemy but also the entire people is used by Russia in Ukraine. Before we move on, I will remind you that you can support this channel financially. You can do this by following the link in the description. There is a Patreon. This is is a service for recurring payments, where you can subscribe to a certain role and get the appropriate bonuses. Also, you can buy an NVPN. This is a means to bypass blocking, which allows you to watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, go to blocked resources, and so on. That is, without VPN, it is now quite difficult to imagine your life. But I offer you my own, for which I am responsible in front of your head. You can buy it by following the link in the description, and by NVPN, you support this channel. Now there are a lot of discussions about this new law of the project, which is unclear what it prohibits. Well, that is, it has not been introduced yet, not adopted. You probably saw it as the law of the project prohibits conscious viewing of extremist materials. I do not comment on it specifically for the simple reason that I do not understand that it prohibits it. Well, that is, it's not that legal madness, it's basically madness. Secondly, many do not really understand what such extremist material is. Well, for example, my channel or many YouTube channels that you watch are not recognized as extremist material. I am not an extremist at all. I am only an agent and a criminal in the case of fake habarmy. That is, I do not have an extremist status. I am not toxic in this sense. But even those who are extremists, those who are recognized by the Russian state as extremists, their material does not immediately become extremist. Well, that is, there is a list of lists where extremist material is. There, for example, the songs of Timur Matsarev, Slava KPSS, and the group Pornofilm. Therefore, watching the same YouTube is not extremism, even if we imagine that these amendments will really be adopted. Moreover, it is not very clear what they are going to do with it. That is, this law does not prohibit VPN, does not prohibit its use. That is, I still do not fully understand what they want. Moreover, I have a suspicion that in fact it is all some kind of nonsense. Well, because you probably saw that Margarita Simonyan and Ekaterina Mizyulina spoke against these amendments, and the Russian authorities have such a tactic. They throw in some kind of nonsense, and then the Russian propagandists speak against it, simulating some kind of public pressure. Because in Russia, the public pressure tactic only works in very, very limited cases, and in this case, when propagandists join the public pressure tactic, this is usually a special unbeatable game in order for the state to say, okay, Margarita Simonyan opposed us, we reject this, but they still accept some beep, but people are already happy and celebrate victory because they did not accept the beep that initially looked like the most tough beep, but some beep is softer. I have a suspicion that we see something like this, or there is always an option that just, well, since deputies do not read anything before accepting any amendments to some kind of bill, then someone just threw this beep in and like no one read it and it was just, accepted until there is no law. Yes, that is, there is still not approved by the Fed, in my opinion. The third reading has not yet passed, the president has not signed it, so this is also one of the options, so I do not comment much because I do not understand what to comment on. I read these amendments, well, they say nonsense, well, that is, nonsense does not mean that it is anti-constitutional, and that it violates rights and that it is immoral, of course, yes, but it is not clear what is forbidden there. Well, that is, it is not explained in any way. There is no prohibition of VPNs, there is no prohibition of any additional materials. That is, it is said that somehow if you specifically Googled the extremist material, then you will be fined, while the authors themselves say that type if once, then it's not scary, if 2 times, and if, for example, you can hear Nacke also writes about this, and can you look at each extremist material a couple of times. In short, it looks strange. It is not clear how it is technically implemented. So for now, I don't know. I think it's some kind of warm-up, and I don't pay attention yet. See how? On the one hand, it was self-advertising, and on the other hand, I expressed my opinion on this strange bill. We will follow, we will watch. Again, we have no reason not to suspect the Russian state in stupidity, in cannibalism. That is, they can take anything. The other thing is that in this very bill it is not written what exactly they want to prohibit and how they are going to prohibit all this. That is, there are no mechanics, and therefore so far it does not cause me confidence that this is exactly how it will be accepted. And if it is accepted, then it will be necessary to see what they will do with it, because until they just don't mean that, again, I have already explained this for the 3rd time. Nevertheless, it does not mean that I am directly against it. Of course, I am against it, but I do not understand against what. Well, that is, what exactly they want to do in general. I like you look at the comments of lawyers and experts and try to understand what kind of movement is quite strange. Well, we move on. Move on to the front line. According to the deep state, the FSRF has expanded the control zone south of the Donetsk, located southwest of Pokrovsk. Control over this inhabited point is important for Russia to cut the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration's logistical routes. Same goals serve the Russian offensive on the eastern flank in the direction of Rodinskoye to the north of Myrnograd. In general, in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians implement the same tactics that were used, starting with Avdiivka and Ugledar, to bypass the inhabited point from the flanks, to block or put the supply routes, after which to expel Ukrainians from the city. In fact, all the actions of Russian armed forces under Pokrovsk have been subordinated to this general operational plan since last year. However, so far the defense forces do not allow it to be fully implemented. Deep State notes the progress of the Russian forces in the area of Tolstoy and Fedorovka in the South Donetsk direction. In the project, they tell in detail about the course of the Russian offensive in the south of Donetsk, which, unfortunately, has not been stopped yet. Katsap says they are moving intensively towards the administrative border of the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk regions, occupying villages and positions that are on their way, he writes in Deep State. The entire area from Alexeyevka to Novopol is under the pressure of Russian armed forces, which with the help of its main resource infantry and huge losses is making its way to the occupation of Donetsk. Active are the areas of the Dacha and the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Russians are constantly trying to penetrate in order to secure the universe. The defense forces make an effort not to let this happen. Also, the settlement of Yalta, which is almost at the administrative border, through which the Russian forces are trying to break through. The chaotic situation is observed at Novohitskoye, Podobno, Myrno, Perebudov, Kamer, Fedorovka, Voskresenko. This is a very difficult area, the analysts write. To analyze it is one of the most difficult tasks in all directions. For the Russians, the main goal in the Donetsk region remains its complete capture, and this is not news. The fundamental task is also to reach the administrative border of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, primarily for the sake of the propaganda effect in the media. This is also not a surprise. But a huge part of the success of Russian armed forces is the lie from the place in the reports about the real situation of the case, which hinders adequately assessing the risks and reacting to the change of the situation at a higher level. At the site from the Green Guide to the Green Field, where the commanders were given the opportunity to report honestly without consequences, they continued as usual. And this is a huge problem that carries catastrophic consequences. Lies will destroy us all, which in turn warns us of a deep state. Here, once again, of course, I want to express my regret that Mikhail Drapety is no longer focused on this particular direction or does not have enough full power, because it was with his direct leadership that the past offensive of the Russians on Pokrovsk was stopped. Unfortunately, now we see that the Russians have certain successes in the Donetsk region in the Pokrovsk direction. Also, Deep State tells in detail about the situation in Malinovka at the junction of the Zaporizhzhia and South Donetsk directions. They do not confirm the previous report by Zetniks about taking the settlement, but they admit that the situation there is critical, so this is what the analysts write. Russians have been trying to completely capture the village for a long time, and attempts to advance were carried out repeatedly over a long time. The Russian infantry actively felt our defense, constantly carried out assault operations, and ran into the village. After the discovery of the scum, they tried to destroy them, but the number often increased. Now you can see the expansion of the red zone within the settlement. Russian armed forces puts pressure on the field of responsibility of the territorial defense units, as they understand that they have a great advantage in means and even more in live force. At places, although they try to stop the enemy with all forces and all available people, but without support, they will soon be forced to give the enemy a raspberry. In addition, any actions on the line of combat contact stretch the defense order, more positions are required, which means more personnel composition. The lack of TRO is a problem that has been standing in front of the forces of defense since 1922. Let me remind you that initially the TRO was generally created as a militia in the case of a rapid advance of the Russians to protect their cities and villages and to resist the occupied territory. When the front was more or less stabilized, the TRO units, which were in the rear, began to be used as line brigades, allocating them for protection to a specific section of the front. They immediately became less resistant, not because of some low morale, but because of the lack of resources available in regular units, in particular artillery and armored vehicles, as well as the shortcomings of competent officers. As we can see, Russian armed forces is aware of the shortcomings of the TRO and is still using them. Russian armed forces has expanded the control zone around the recently occupied border village of Milovoye of the Kharkiv region, moving towards Ambarnov, states Deep State. The actions of the Russians on the border territory have the task of disengaging the reserve of the defense forces to prevent them from fully holding other areas of the front of the border with Kharkiv and Sumchina, which was recently written by, for example, the Ukrainian military inspector Konstantin Mashevets. The Okogoro resource publishes an infographic of the intensity of Russian attacks over the past week, July 7-13, on the basis of a summary by the General Staff of the Soviet Union. The number of clashes has increased by 13% compared to the previous week. Expected activity in the Pokrovsk and Kherson directions is also noted, where 43 attacks were recorded over the past week, as well as record intensity of battles in the Pokrovsk direction. The number of attacks there has increased to 453, by 17% compared to the previous week. If we turn to the previous report by Okogorov, it turns out that this increase in intensity is due to the fall that took place in June. In general, the WSRF is trying to maintain the tempo of attacks at the level of about 180 per day, which was also noted, for example, in Deep State. Why such a number of attacks is becoming the cause of record Russian losses, I told you in a recent video. After the new commander of the Ukrainian forces and unmanned systems, Robert Matabrody, declared a hunt for Russian warheads and even increased their value in the FUCs, the WSRF pilots were expected to start adapting. The Ukrainian military author of the Telegram channel Officer talks about one interesting way of defense. Russian pilots roar in one direction for airfields, trenches several hundred meters long, which are then covered and carefully masked by Pishitin. As a result, the drone flies these few hundred meters along the improvised tunnel and only then flies out into the open space where it can be fixed. Therefore, if you have found a place to launch enemy FPV drones, this does not mean that you have found the location of their operators. Be careful, the officer advises. In my opinion, it looks like a good tactical solution, and it is not yet clear how to fight it. But it is already clear that Ukrainian pilots should take it to arms or come up with something of their own, because the Russians are also trying to hunt drone operators of the Ukrainian Defense Force. In one of the previous reports, I have already told you about the problems with the supply of drones in the Russian army and the construction of unmanned troops, which is going through a huge cut in the direction of elite units. Now I will tell you more about this in detail by the Russian military officer Sviatoslav Golikov. His post is quite long, but it allows you to understand what is wrong with Russian unmanned troops. Coming back, he writes about what he called a weak cosplay of the forces of the enemy's unmanned systems. We are now in the very third quarter in which he planned to complete the formation of the structures of our troops of the unmanned systems. At the same time, it is not yet clear who these troops are headed by. It would be extremely interesting to compare this figure with the Hungarian. As for the structure itself, the basis of its formation is the combat units of the CPBT Rubicon, which is a part of each of our 6 troops. The first months of building Rubicon's combat work were accompanied by drawn reports and excessive hype, citing a person who himself regularly works on the ground and is deeply involved in the topic, writes Golikov. At first, he brings his words. In the Kursk direction, the report result consisted of the actual results of more than 24 units of different departments that they issued drones and, accordingly, took the video. Then, for reports, they began to use, among other things, a video base, which they accumulated over a long time. In addition, the technology itself, the construction of the video when at the last moment at 30-40 meters before the target, suddenly the top of the frame and the target is painted red. But it is not clear whether the drone flew at all to the most difficult last meters. Lately, they have begun to give real results, but with an actual unlimited supply, this is not wise. End of quote. The enemy itself notes the current effectiveness of Rubicon's actions, writes Golikov further, but this effectiveness is achieved, in fact, to the damage to the general military units of the BPL. For clarity, I offer a few examples for a discount of the reports of Rubicon himself. From several different directions. On June 16, near the Zerk settlement, the operator of the BPA-29 Army discovered a masked SAU M109 Paladin produced by the United States. The coordinates were given to Rubicon. On the night of June 17, Rubicon's calculations worked on the SAU VSU Lancet. The SAU was destroyed. On June 19, the reconnaissance of the 5th Brigade found the work of the BPA group in the SAU and passed the coordinates to Rubicon. Rubicon's lightning calculations struck the house in which the VSU men were hiding. There are a few more similar examples there. I will not give them completely. Here's how Golikov summarizes them. He writes these examples. On the one hand, it shows the presence of interaction between the general military structures and the combat units of Rubicon, which is generally positive. But on the other hand, it emphasizes the lack of strike air and unmanned vehicles in the general military structures. Thus, Golikov summarizes, our army of unmanned systems are built with a radical shift in material supply in favor of the combat units of Rubicon, including excessive reservation and limited supply of standard BPL units in military units and units up to the extreme of Katsev's supply principle. He writes that the standard BPL units have no supply at all according to the lines of defense. By the way, I will add from myself, for example, the story of Ernest Yagudvin that if there are no standard pilots in the unit, and in Russian units this is most often the case, then no one hinders sending the pilots to the assault, as they are often infantry on paper. That is, instead of a systematic and complex approach, Golikov continues, who demonstrates the enemy, our side focuses on a bright PR project and playing on unlimited supply, lags behind in the update of the US Army and the scaling of technology. Golikov makes a conclusion. In 2025, a new system for sending mercenaries to the Dobropillia front has been developed in Russia. According to this scheme, more than 1,500 people could be sent to war in Ukraine. They have replenished the units of the volunteer corps with a structure under the control of the GRU. Now there is a choice of potential mercenaries. Conclude a volunteer contract on the old system in a row with the opportunity to terminate the contract at any time. To fight in a semi-legal status without a social guarantee, some mercenaries principally choose the old system of recruitment. You recruit according to the new system Dobropillia, which promises a more legal status of a military man with access to social benefits and a regional payout. It is true that it is impossible to break such a contract until the end of the term, and the payout is not always possible to receive. Like ordinary contractors, volunteers recruited by both systems fight not until the end of the SVO, but can go home after completing the contract. The main curator of the volunteer corps, where the set is conducted according to both schemes, is the Deputy Chief of the State Security Service, General Lieutenant Vladimir Alexeyev. In Ukraine, the corps in fact replaced another mercenary formation, the CHVK Wagner, which was disbanded after the unsuccessful rally of Evgeny Prigogine. Spent live force, as volunteers call the deputy of the Russian State Duma and the head of the Union of Volunteers of Donbass, Alexander Borodai. At the end of 1924, the audio recording of his telephone conversation with several officers of Borodai was sent to the network. Beneficiary of the new scheme of the volunteer corps, since a whole brigade was created under the guidance of the SDD, which enters this corps. A total of 27 units are included in the volunteer corps. All of them use two schemes of hiring, Redut and Dobropillia. The most famous of them are the Volga veterans, the near-football Spaniard and St. George. To be honest, I don't quite understand why you need such a parallel system at all. In the full investigation of the system, which can be read on the channel Nacke, it is assumed that the whole thing is in competition between the GRU and other structures of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, responsible for the set of contractors. Perhaps I assume for myself, in the GRU they just wanted to have their own combat unit, for example, opponents from the GRU of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. In addition, the contractors are those who, for some reason, do not want to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, such as neo-Nazis from Spain. But the troops are performed by the strange methods of the beginning of the war. At least 133 people who fought in the Russian army were in the Ukrainian captivity. They were eventually replaced, and after that they were again on the front line where the informants were killed or disappeared. The list of I Want to Live projects has been transferred to Veska. Journalists verified and analyzed these data. In the list of dead military personnel are mobilized fighters of Chuvikov Wagner from 49 Russian regions and 3 occupied regions of Ukraine, as well as from the Crimea. Residents of Donetsk and Lugansk regions died on the front after returning from captivity most often. Veska found 44 such cases in the rest of the regions, from 1 to 5 dead. More than half of the list of 71 people did not live for years after returning from captivity, some only for several months, more than 2 years, 15 servicemen. Regardless of the position, rank, and term of service, those returning from captivity almost immediately returned to their positions after exchange. As indicated in the full material in Verska, which can be read on their website, this is illegal, as it contradicts the position of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. In Ukraine, this position is implemented by the law on the mobilization of 1924. Exchange soldiers can be demobilized at their own will. In particular, the former head of the Azov brigade, Bogdan Krovich, who was captured in Mariupol, used this right. After exchange, he returned to the ranks of the defense forces, and in 1925 he ended his service without obstacles. So continues the lawlessness in the Russian units. I have already given you a message to the wife of a Russian military man complaining about the expenditure of money to the commandment of the 9th Separate Rifle Brigade of Russian Armed Forces. Now another military man complained about the lawlessness of the 9th FSBR. The mother of a military man, Trumtov Konstantin, or Trutnov Konstantin, who served in the 9th Separate Rifle Brigade, the military unit 71443, said that her son had also become a victim of the expenditure. Konstantin was injured and underwent treatment in Iska. After the treatment, he was assigned to the category of G. Temporarily disqualified and a vacation of 60 days is prescribed. But after a while, after arriving in the unit, Konstantin was sent to a pit where he was beaten, even despite the fact that he was after the injury and the leg was gypsum. He was beaten, demanded money, and was made to voluntarily renounce medical care, and therefore he was sent to the training ground. At the training ground, the fighter was sent after his allegedly voluntary refusal to be treated. There, he was forced to move in an armored vest on crutches when the time for recovery had not yet expired. The fact is that not even 30 days have passed, not even 60. The leg did not heal. The leg swells because, of course, it is not treated. He was beaten there in the PVD of Alexander. On the leg of this patient was beaten, in the hypnosis that he was. He says that he broke his leg again, broke his broken leg, he broke it again. and at the training ground he was given an armor vest and crutches. That is, at the training ground he walks in an armor vest and on crutches. According to the mother of the soldier, when the payment for the injury came, the fighter was forced to give all the money. At the same time, it was necessary to write an appropriate list, allegedly with a voluntary desire to give them. They forced him to give all the money, and at the same time, they forced him to write a paper that he voluntarily gives these money. In a correspondence with his mother, Konstantin confirmed the statement of the soldier's wife, Alexandra Aremyeva, about the need to give all the money earned to the ex-servicemen. Both of the soldiers had been in contact with them before they broke up. They managed to inform their relatives that they are directly involved in the assault of the brigade with the nickname Berzima Ulyan, whose criminal actions are under the command of the brigade. But in fact, this is scattered in all Russian brigades, and thank God that it is so, in the sense that it really reduces the combat capacity of the brigade. And I just hope, talking about these cases, that knowing about them, telling about them to your family and friends, you can save them from getting into the Russian army, well, or call on those who have already entered there to be deserted. One of my main goals is to reduce the number of Russian military in Ukraine, and I support it at least from two ends. This is with the National Security Service, which helps the armed forces of Ukraine to fight the fascist occupation army. And the second is the conviction of people not to go there or to desert from there if they have already been hit. And that's why I'm telling you all these endless stories that are not about overrides in places, but which are the system of the Russian army. Because only with such a system, where everything is allowed by the commanders, where they can zero out, where they can torture, where they can help out, only with such a system can you turn a soldier into a cattle, which you can send to local assaults, where most of them will not survive, and they know about it. However, there's no rest even after death. The regular rubric SVOs are not needed even after death. Participant of the SVO Marat Kikimzhena from the village of Troitskaya, Sverdlovsk region, wrote a letter to the local administration. According to the military man, the road to the graves of his own son and brother, who died at the SVO, is completely destroyed and it is impossible to pass. Right across the grave, where the buried participants of the combat actions, a real dump is organized. No one needs anything, decent people lie here. This is how the country is treated. Garbage on the opposite side of the heroes' alleys. Look, and no one cleans it. The head of the administration says, well, what can I do? This is how no one cleans anything. According to him, the local authorities promised to put everything in order. However, nothing has been done so far. Marat was particularly outraged by the fact that he had found an abandoned flag among the garbage in the cemetery, which had previously been installed on the graves of the dead participants of the war. Today we came here to the grave. Look, this is a trash can. We will put a flag, and a Russian flag. I consider this to be vandalism complete. Well, the presence of the Russian military cemeteries on the dumps, it seems to me quite logical. But it is important to understand that all the stories of the Russian authorities about the fact that both the dead and the living participants of the war are heroes, new elites, and that they are actually fighting for the country, this is all a lie. Neither the state nor the citizens believe in this. They are a consumable material which dies and becomes colleagues of Vladimir Putin's personal ambitions and his entourage. For their luxurious palaces, for the wedding of Adam Kadyrov and his watch with Jelena Vagin's diamonds, for this, Russia is literally waging war. Do you want to be a part of this? Do you want to be buried in the dumpster so that your relatives, still alive, would come to your grave and see what terrible condition they are in? Do you want to die for all these traditional values, which, judging by what the Russian authorities are doing, are due to the presence of their palaces? This is where the whole tradition ends. This was Michael Nacke. See you soon. All the best. Bye.